It is November 2005 in Johannesburg, and the world outside Jacob Zuma's home is quiet, but inside, a storm is about to begin, one that will ripple across South Africa's courts, its politics, and its conscience. Tonight is the night an allegation is made that would nearly derail the man who is already seen as a frontrunner for the presidency. You lean closer, hearing the low hum of city traffic outside, imagining the heavy stillness of a modest living room where a private encounter transforms into a national scandal. This is the beginning of Jacob Zuma, the president accused of rape. Welcome. You're listening to 102 Hours, your late-night companion for true crime and untold mysteries. Settle in with me as we untangle one of the most controversial trials in South African history. If you haven't already, make sure you like this story, subscribe for more, and, because I love knowing where you're retuning in from, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Now, let us draw the curtain back on a night that blurred the lines between personal scandal and political theater. The evening begins with Zuma, then South Africa's deputy president, hosting a woman he has known for years. Her name is Fezile Kuzwayo, but she will become known across the world by a single name, Kwezi. The two share a long family connection. Her father was an ANC comrade of Zuma Iwaho's during the anti-apartheid struggle, and she had grown up referring to him as an uncle figure. That backdrop makes what happens next so unsettling. By her account, she trusted him as a protector. By his account, the encounter was consensual. The difference between those two versions of the story is the reason we are here tonight. Kwezi was no ordinary accuser. She was a 31-year-old AIDS activist, HIV positive herself, outspoken and fearless. That fact alone carried a heavy weight in a country battling one of the world's most severe HIV epidemics. She later testified that she had not expected intimacy at all that night, and that when Zuma advanced, she froze. Zuma, in turn, told the court she had initiated signals that, in his words, any man would have read as consent. The clash of narratives could not have been starker. Investigators still question whether Zuma's version was shaped by genuine belief or political calculation. What we know for certain is that after the alleged incident, Kwezi went to the police, filing a complaint that would push the private into the public. Just weeks later, on 6 December 2005, prosecutors confirmed the unthinkable. The man expected to lead South Africa was now charged with rape. The charge was not just a legal blow, it was a cultural earthquake. The African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela, suddenly faced an internal rift: rally behind Zuma, their charismatic comrade, or distance themselves from a man tainted by scandal. Ordinary South Africans found themselves choosing sides. Some believed Kwezi's bravery was a symbol of accountability in a patriarchal society. Others insisted Zuma was being targeted by political enemies, framed to destroy his career. The split would only deepen as the trial unfolded. It's almost surreal to recall that this was happening just over a decade into democracy. South Africa was still healing from apartheid, still finding its identity as a young nation. And here was a case that forced it to confront questions about power, gender, and justice. As one fringe pamphlet circulating at the time put it, a nation cannot heal if its leaders are accused of crimes against its daughters. It was heavy language, but in the heat of 2005, emotions were raw, and the streets outside the courthouse echoed with chants and counter-chants. Behind closed doors, the investigation pressed on. Kwezi provided a statement, described the details, and emphasized that she had said no. Zuma hired a legal team renowned for aggressive cross-examination. Every detail of their relationship, from family ties to casual text messages, became potential evidence. You imagine the weight she must have felt. Her name whispered in headlines, her face painted on protest placards, her trust in an older family friend turned into a courtroom battlefield. And then came the public silence. For weeks after the charge, Zuma spoke little in public. He appeared calm, even defiant, insisting that the truth would clear his name. Yet, inside ANC corridors, whispers grew louder. Could he still become president with this stain on his record? Could the party survive if he did not? The stakes were staggering. This is where you begin to feel the depth of the story. It is not simply about an allegation in a private home. It is about how one evening lit a fire under an entire nation. One man's ambition, one woman's voice, and the fragile promise of a new democracy collided in that Johannesburg house. And as we step into the next chapter, you will see just how quickly personal choices become national trials. You rewind the story now, stepping back from that charged November night and looking instead at the long path that carried Jacob Zuma into that Johannesburg living room. To understand why this single allegation carried such power, you need to understand who Zuma was before the scandal, how he rose from a young herd boy in rural KwaZulu-Natal to the man positioned as South Africa's next president. The trajectory is almost cinematic. Humble beginnings, militant struggle, political exile, and finally a seat in the inner circle of post-apartheid leadership. Without that arc, the trial in 2006 would have been just another headline. With it, the case became a test of how South Africa judged its heroes. Zuma was born in 1942 in Nkandla, a rural area where his family lived with very little. His father died when he was still a child, and formal schooling was out of reach. He never received more than a handful of years of education, but what he lacked in classrooms, he made up for in political apprenticeship. By his teens, he joined the African National Congress, absorbing the rhythms of struggle like a second language. You can picture him as a wiry young man, moving quietly between meetings in dusty townships, listening more than speaking. Investigators still question whether Zuma's early charisma was forged naturally or sharpened as a survival tool in those clandestine years. By 1963, he was arrested for conspiring against the apartheid state and sentenced to 10 years on Robben Island. There, he encountered men like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and other giants of the liberation movement. For Zuma, prison became an unlikely university. He learned politics, strategy, even some formal literacy. When he emerged in the 1970s, he carried both scars and credibility. That credibility grew in exile. He served as a key ANC intelligence officer, shuttling between Mozambique and other neighboring countries, orchestrating resistance while South Africa tightened its grip at home, a quirky detail often left in the margins. Zuma was said to be an excellent dancer, using traditional Zulu steps at political rallies to charm crowds and cement his image as a man of the people. The dance would follow him throughout his career, appearing even at major campaign rallies decades later. It seems almost trivial, but in a land where politics and performance were deeply entwined, those small gestures mattered. They told ordinary South Africans that Zuma was not an aloof intellectual, but a comrade who understood them. By the 1990s, when apartheid finally collapsed, Zuma was a central figure in KwaZulu-Natal politics, mediating between bloody rivalries of the ANC and Inkatha Freedom Party. He built a reputation as a negotiator, a peacemaker, and someone who could manage the volatility of South Africa's most violent province. In 1999, President Thabo Mbeki elevated him to deputy president. Suddenly, the boy from Nkandla was just one step away from the highest office. But the political landscape was shifting. South Africans were becoming impatient with economic inequality, service delivery failures, and the perception that Mbeki's government was too aloof. Zuma's earthy style, laughing easily, speaking in isiZulu, hugging supporters, was the perfect counterbalance. He looked less like a polished bureaucrat and more like the man who would share a meal with you after work. For many, that authenticity was irresistible. At the same time, cracks appeared. In 2005, Zuma's name was tied to a sprawling corruption scandal involving his financial advisor, Schabir Shaik. Shaik was convicted of fraud and corruption, and Zuma was dismissed from his deputy presidency by Mbeki. It was a blow, but paradoxically it also freed Zuma to present himself as a victim of political conspiracies. His supporters rallied harder. Some wore t-shirts emblazoned with his face and slogans like 100% Zulu Boy. It was an early sign that Zuma's base was emotionally invested in him, not just politically, but culturally. It is into this backdrop that the rape charge exploded. The timing could not have been more precarious. Zuma, already under political fire, his career wobbling between downfall and destiny. And then, a rape accusation by the daughter of a trusted comrade. To many, it looked like a setup, fuel for the narrative that enemies wanted Zuma destroyed. To others, it looked like a devastating betrayal of both a family bond and the ideals of a new democracy. What's fascinating is how quickly the case became a mirror for the nation. South Africa, only a decade free from apartheid, was still asking who could be trusted to lead. Zuma was not just another politician, he was a symbol, both to his followers and his detractors. Supporters argued he was the embodiment of resilience, the man who had risen from poverty and prison. Critics argued he was reckless, unfit, and now, perhaps, dangerous. The courtroom would decide the legal question, but the political question was already being fought in the streets. As you sit with this story, you notice how the pieces line up. The rural boy, the prisoner, the exile, the negotiator, the deputy president, each stage adding weight to the scandal that followed. Without this history, the trial might have faded quickly. With it, the accusation carried the power to shake the foundations of the ANC itself. And the irony, that even at his lowest point, Zuma's story was far from over. You turn now to the woman at the heart of this storm, Fezekile Nsukela Kuzwayo, known to South Africans as Kwezi. To understand this story fully, you must sit with her presence, her history, and the courage it took for her to step forward. Too often, she has been reduced to a footnote in Jacob Zuma's political drama. But in truth, Kwezi's life was remarkable, and her role in Jacob Zuma, the president accused of rape, transformed her into a reluctant symbol for women's rights in a country wrestling with gender violence. Fezekile was born in exile in 1974. Her parents were fierce anti-apartheid activists, and political struggle was the air she breathed. She grew up in places like Zambia and Tanzania, far from her ancestral home in South Africa. Zuma himself knew her father. He was a fellow ANC fighter. That bond tied the families together. To Fezekile, Jacob Zuma was not simply a political figure, he was an uncle, a man whose age and status placed him firmly in the category of protector. Investigators still question whether those family ties gave her an added sense of trust, or whether they deepened the betrayal she later described. By the mid-1990s, after the end of apartheid, Kwezi returned to South Africa. She was young, educated, and already active in HIV/AIDS advocacy. That work was no small thing in a country facing one of the world's worst epidemics. She herself was HIV positive, and rather than hide it, she used her voice to push for awareness, testing, and destigmatization. Imagine that bravery. In a society where stigma was crushing, she stood up and said, "This is my truth." Yet courage often comes with cost. Friends said she carried trauma from earlier experiences, including incidents of sexual assault in her youth. Despite that pain, she kept speaking, kept writing, kept working for change. Her circle of comrades respected her. To them, she was Kwezi, the one who would challenge silence even if her voice shook. And then came November 2005. She visited Zuma's Johannesburg home, expecting a safe space, a meal, perhaps a conversation. What followed, by her account, was a violation that stunned her. A trusted elder and family figure ignoring her refusals, leaving her shaken. Zuma told a different story, that Kwezi gave signals of consent, that the intimacy was mutual. Those conflicting accounts formed the heart of the trial. But for Kwezi, filing the police report was more than legal procedure. It was an act of defiance in a society where women often stay silent. A quirky detail emerges in retellings of the trial. During testimony, Kwesi mentioned she wore a kanga, a traditional cloth wrap, on the night in question. Zuma's supporters twisted this, chanting outside the courthouse that her clothing signaled consent. The phrase, "she wore a kanga," became a cruel weapon, a reminder of how victim-blaming narratives can overwhelm justice. Protesters danced and sang in support of Zuma, while Kwesi had to walk through jeering crowds calling her a liar. Inside the courtroom, she faced intense cross-examination. Every aspect of her private life was dragged into public. Her past, her health, her trauma. Imagine sitting there, your HIV status and history of assault debated by lawyers, dissected in newspapers, and discussed in taxi ranks across the country. South Africa's appetite for gossip was insatiable, and Kwesi was forced to carry that burden with composure. Investigators still question whether the trial was fair to her, whether the judge's ultimate decision truly reflected justice or the weight of politics. What is clear is that Kwesi paid a price long after the verdict. Even after Zuma was acquitted, she was harassed, vilified, and threatened. Her safety was never guaranteed. In 2007, she and her mother fled to the Netherlands, granted asylum because life at home had become unbearable. And yet, Kwesi's legacy grew. When she returned years later, she re-entered quietly, often avoiding media. She passed away in 2016, mourned by feminists, activists, and friends who saw her as a warrior. Perhaps the most haunting moment came that same year, when 4 young women interrupted Zuma's speech in Parliament, holding placards that read, "Remember Kwesi." Their silent protest was short but unforgettable. It reminded the nation that while Zuma's acquittal cleared him legally, the story of Kwesi could not be erased. She was not simply the accuser. She was a daughter of the struggle, an activist, a truth-teller who stood against one of the most powerful men in the country. In telling her story, you are reminded that true crime narratives are not just about the accused. They are about the silenced, the courageous, and the ones who demand to be heard. And tonight, as you listen, Kwesi's name lingers, not as a shadow of scandal, but as a testament to bravery. It is December 6, 2005, when the news breaks. Jacob Zuma, former deputy president of South Africa and still one of the most powerful figures in the ANC, is formally charged with rape. The announcement sends shockwaves across the country, leaving South Africans in disbelief. You can almost picture the crowded press conference, journalists leaning forward, notebooks in hand, flashbulbs popping, while prosecutors read out the charges. A man once seen as destined for the presidency is now set to face one of the most serious accusations possible. In that instant, the line between political theater and personal scandal disappears. Jacob Zuma. The president accused of rape has become a matter for the courts, the public, and the history books. The charge itself was stark. Zuma was accused of raping Fezekile Kwesi Kuzwayo on the night of November 2, 2005 in his Johannesburg home. She was HIV positive, an AIDS activist, and, crucially, the daughter of a fellow anti-apartheid fighter. Zuma did not deny that sex took place. Instead, he claimed it was consensual. That detail alone made the trial unusual. Most rape cases revolve around denial of the act, not debate over consent. Here, the admission was blunt. Zuma's defense would hinge not on whether the encounter happened, but on how it was interpreted. Investigators still question whether prosecutors underestimated the intensity of Zuma EIS support base when they pursued the case. The ANC at the time was riven with factions, and Zuma's allies quickly framed the charge as part of a conspiracy. "They are trying to destroy our leader," some declared. Crowds began to gather outside the courthouse almost immediately, some carrying placards defending him, others denouncing him. The atmosphere felt less like a criminal trial and more like a political rally. What many forget is that December 2005 was already a turbulent month for Zuma. He had been dismissed as deputy president earlier that year after his financial advisor Shabir Sheikh was convicted of fraud and corruption linked to Zuma himself. For his supporters, the rape charge looked like yet another move in a broader campaign to cut him down before he could rise again. For his critics, the combination of corruption scandals and a rape trial painted a devastating picture of unfitness for leadership. The two narratives clashed in the streets, echoing in chants, songs, and insults hurled at one another. A quirky moment from the early days of the trial captures the tension. One group of protesters outside the courthouse sang liberation songs from the apartheid era, the same songs Zuma himself once sang as a freedom fighter. Another group altered the lyrics, mocking him instead. The melodies of struggle, once unifying, became weapons in a cultural tug-of-war. Inside the ANC, the leadership tried to tread carefully. President Thabo Mbeki remained largely silent, allowing the courts to do their work. But silence did not mean neutrality. Behind closed doors, loyalties were being tested. Some ANC branches declared open support for Zuma, warning that if he fell, the party risked splitting. Others worried that his presence under such scandal would taint the movement that Mandela had once led. The charge also forced the justice system into the spotlight. South Africa had one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world, and women's rights groups seized the moment. They demanded that Kweisi's case be taken seriously, not brushed aside because the accused was powerful. For them, the trial was not just about Zuma. It was about every woman silenced, every survivor doubted, every victim blamed. Zuma, for his part, projected calm confidence. He told supporters he would prove his innocence in court, insisting the truth was on his side. His legal team began preparing for a defense that would be both technical and political, blending courtroom strategy with public messaging. Every move seemed calibrated, deny conspiracy theories directly, but allow loyalists outside to shout them loudly. It was a balancing act, and Zuma walked it with the same ease he once used on the political stage. Investigators still question whether the courts could ever truly separate law from politics in this case. Could judges rule purely on evidence when the streets outside boiled with chants of Zuma for president? Could jurors, if there had been any, have ignored the pressure? South Africa's young democracy was being tested in real time. December 2005, then, was more than a month of legal paperwork. It was the moment when a private accusation became a national reckoning. The charge did not just place Zuma in the dock, it placed the entire country under a microscope. Would South Africa prove itself able to hold even its most powerful figures accountable? Or would loyalty, culture, and politics outweigh the voice of a single woman who dared to speak against a giant? As the calendar flipped to 2006, the stage was set. The courtroom would soon become a battleground, and the world would be watching. You step into early 2006 when the courthouse in Johannesburg becomes more than a legal venue. It transforms into a theater of division. As Zuma's rape trial begins, the sidewalks outside overflow with chants, banners, and bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. One side belts out 100% Zulu Boy slogans, draped in t-shirts with Zuma's smiling face. The other side raises placards that read, "Justice for Kweisi," voices echoing through the streets. It is no longer a single case, it is a mirror reflecting a nation split in two. The trial begins formally on March 6, 2006, in the Johannesburg High Court. Inside, the air is tense, but outside, the atmosphere is almost carnival-like. Pro-Zuma supporters dance, sing liberation songs, and frame the case as a plot by political enemies. Some wave ANC flags, turning the courthouse steps into a party rally. Across the barricades, women's groups chant about gender-based violence, furious that their country's future president could even be accused of such a crime. The line between legal process and political spectacle blurs more with every passing day. A quirky, if disturbing, detail illustrates the climate. Vendors appear near the courthouse selling food, t-shirts, even badges that say, "Hands off Zuma." The trial is not just news. It's business, entertainment, identity politics rolled into one. You can almost imagine the street sizzling with the smell of fried snacks, the beat of drums, and the sharp cries of protesters clashing in song. For Kwesi, the divide is cruelly personal. Each morning she arrives at court, slipping past hostile crowds who jeer, whistle, and call her names. Some even shout that her HIV status makes her untrustworthy. For her supporters, this harassment proves exactly why women hesitate to report sexual assault. They ask, if the daughter of a respected ANC comrade can be ridiculed, what chance does any ordinary woman have? Inside the ANC, the fracture deepens. Branches in KwaZulu-Natal pledge open loyalty to Zuma, staging busloads of supporters outside the courthouse. Meanwhile, urban factions in Johannesburg and Cape Town call for restraint, urging the party not to risk its credibility. President Thabo Mbeki, still in power, tries to remain aloof. But whispers circulate. Some claim Mbeki quietly welcomes Zuma's troubles, seeing them as a way to neutralize a rival. Investigators still question whether political sabotage played any role, or whether Zuma's supporters simply used that narrative to galvanize loyalty. The tension spills into parliament and community meetings. In Soweto, taxi ranks buzz with arguments. Is Kwesi a liar, or is Zuma untouchable? At universities, debates rage in lecture halls. Even church pulpits are not immune, with some pastors praying publicly for Zuma's vindication, while women's groups decry the use of faith to shield powerful men. South Africa, barely more than a decade out of apartheid, finds itself arguing over whose voice matters most, a powerful leader's or a woman's. The police maintain tight security around the courthouse, but they cannot contain the symbolic battle. Each day, television cameras pan across the dueling crowds, and each evening, households around the nation relive the day's testimony. Dinner tables split. Fathers defend Zuma. Daughters demand justice for Kwesi. Mothers sigh at the weight of it all. You can almost hear those conversations, tense and unresolved. The public mood grows stranger still when fringe groups enter the scene. One tiny party distributes pamphlets claiming the trial is part of an international conspiracy to destabilize South Africa. Another fringe religious sect prays loudly outside court, declaring that Zuma's accusers are agents of evil. It's absurd, even theatrical, but it adds to the noise. In that noise, Kwesi's individual voice struggles to be heard, and yet her courage reverberates. Women's organizations rally under her name, calling her testimony a turning point in the fight against gender-based violence. They remind the nation that South Africa's rate of sexual assault is among the highest in the world, and that if a woman like Kwesi can face such backlash, others have little hope of justice. Their rallies adopt slogans like, "My body is not a battlefield," pushing back against the tide of Zuma's supporters. In the middle of it all, Zuma himself projects calm. He waves at crowds, sometimes dancing with his supporters after court adjourns. His body language says, "I am unbroken." His lawyers insist the case will collapse once the facts are laid out. And for his loyalists, each smile he flashes is proof he is the victim, not the villain. The irony is hard to miss. A trial meant to test one man's guilt or innocence has instead tested the soul of a young democracy. The verdict will be delivered in a courtroom, but the trial is already underway in the streets, in living rooms, in whispers and chants. And as March unfolds, South Africa edges closer to a national reckoning that feels less like justice being done and more like identity itself being contested. You step through the heavy courthouse doors, and the air changes instantly. Outside, chants and drumming drown the streets, but inside, silence sharpens like a blade. Every wooden bench is filled. Journalists scribble furiously and cameras are banned, but everyone knows the world is watching. This is where Jacob Zuma's fate and Kwesi's truth will be dissected word by word. On one side of the room sits Zuma, dressed impeccably, flanked by an army of lawyers. He looks calm, even defiant, sometimes smiling at supporters in the gallery. Across from him sits Kwesi, cloaked in dignity but visibly fragile. She is accompanied by her family and counselors, aware that every answer she gives will be torn apart not only by the defense but by an entire nation eager to pass judgment. Between them, presiding Judge Willem van der Merwe listens intently, his face stern but his questions sharp. The prosecution lays out the charge. On November 2, 2005, Kwesi spent the night at Zuma's Forest Town residence in Johannesburg. She testifies that she slept over expecting safety. Zuma was like an uncle figure, a family comrade from the ANC days. But she says she awoke in the middle of the night to him entering her room, uninvited and forcing himself upon her despite her protests. In her words, she froze, then submitted out of fear, aware that Zuma, a man of immense power, outweighed her in both body and influence. The defense moves quickly to dismantle this account. They argue that Kwesi willingly initiated intimacy, pointing to text messages she sent to Zuma in the days before and after the alleged assault. They suggest she was not a victim but a woman pursuing a consensual relationship. This line of questioning exposes her personal life to the public like raw flesh, prying into her history of trauma, her past relationships, even her health. It is not only a legal strategy, it is a public humiliation. Every witness adds weight or contradiction. Medical experts testify that Kwesi showed no physical injuries consistent with violent rape, though trauma counselors remind the court that many victims do not. A police investigator describes Kwesi's immediate report, noting her distress and insistence that she had been assaulted. Zuma's lawyers counter with arguments that the lack of struggle suggests consent, framing Kwesi as unreliable. The back and forth is relentless, and the gallery listens as though each word could tilt history. The courtroom becomes a clash of narratives. To the prosecution, this is a case of a powerful man abusing trust. To the defense, it is a political ambush dressed up as a sexual assault claim. Even Judge van der Merwe presses both sides with pointed questions, probing inconsistencies in testimony. His interjections hint that he sees gaps in Kwesi's account, but he also scrutinizes Zuma's story, especially when contradictions emerge. As you listen, the atmosphere feels suffocating. Every cough, every shuffle of papers, every strained whisper in the gallery becomes amplified. You sense how both Kwesi and Zuma are performing, not just for the court, but for the millions waiting beyond its walls. The gravity of the testimony is impossible to escape. Two lives locked in a battle where the truth itself feels slippery. And then comes one of the most shocking moments of the trial, when Zuma takes the stand himself. Instead of a distant, shielded figure, he becomes the narrator of his own defense. His testimony, delivered in isiZulu and translated into English, will echo far beyond this courtroom. He admits to having sex with Kwesi that night but insists it was consensual. His tone is measured, confident, almost paternal, as if to suggest he has nothing to hide. What strikes you most in these moments is how deeply the trial exposes more than a private encounter. It exposes South Africa's wounds, patriarchy, HIV stigma, political factionalism, and the painful question of who is believed when a woman accuses a man of power. Inside this courtroom, it is not only Jacob Zuma and Kwesi on trial, it is the conscience of an entire democracy. The day Jacob Zuma takes the stand, the courtroom tightens with anticipation. Every journalist's pen hovers above the page, every ear leans forward, and you sense that what he is about to say will not only shape his defense but carve itself into South Africa as collective memory. When Zuma begins, he does not deny the sexual encounter. He admits openly that he slept with Kwesi that night. But his claim is firm. It was consensual, invited even, and not an act of force. This admission stuns many, for it transforms the trial from a simple denial versus accusation into a battle over interpretation, over what consent really means. Then comes the statement that would echo around the globe, the infamous shower claim. Zuma explains that after unprotected sex with Kwesi, he took a shower because he believed it would reduce the risk of contracting HIV. The words land with a mix of shock and disbelief. In a country with one of the highest HIV infection rates in the world, where decades of awareness campaigns stressed condoms and testing, the idea that a simple shower could protect against HIV feels not only absurd, but dangerous. Reporters scribble furiously, medical experts recoil, and South Africans outside the courthouse shake their heads in disbelief. But Zuma does not waver. He insists that he believed Kwesi was HIV positive and claims his decision to shower was part of his risk management. To his supporters, his words are brushed aside as a cultural misunderstanding, an elder man speaking without the polished caution of a career politician. To his critics, they are proof of recklessness and ignorance, a window into the casual arrogance of someone who assumes his power can bend even science. The testimony digs deeper into cultural currents. Zuma portrays himself as respectful of Zulu traditions, framing his actions as those of a man who believed he was fulfilling expectations of intimacy and care. His lawyers echo this, arguing that the interaction was guided by mutual understanding and that Kwesi misrepresented it afterward. This cultural framing resonates with some in the gallery but sparks outrage in others who see it as a dangerous blending of patriarchal norms and political privilege. Meanwhile, activists outside the courtroom seize on the shower comment as a rallying cry. Protest signs mock the idea, comedians satirize it, and HIV organizations issue statements condemning the misinformation. What Zuma may have thought was a small detail of personal reasoning becomes the most quoted moment of the entire trial, a symbol of how disconnected leaders can be from the urgent health realities of their people. Yet, inside the courtroom, the effect is more subtle. Judge van der Merwe listens carefully, raising his eyebrows but saying little, leaving interpretation for the verdict. The defense maintains that Zuma's honesty, his willingness to admit sex occurred, strengthens his credibility. The prosecution counters that his explanation reveals recklessness, a man careless with responsibility, both in his personal conduct and in the nation's broader fight against HIV. As you watch, you realize the shower claim is more than a bizarre detail. It crystallizes the stakes of this trial. It shows how a single man's choices ripple into public health debates, gender politics, and cultural identity. Zuma may be speaking about one night in Johannesburg, but South Africa is hearing something much larger. A man who could soon be president suggesting that the greatest epidemic of the era can be washed away with water. The courtroom air feels heavier now. You can almost hear the scribbling of notes, the suppressed gasps, the shifting of bodies on the hard benches. And through it all, Zuma sits steady, unshaken, as if certain that his words, no matter how strange to outsiders, will not derail his path to power. As the trial wears on, the tension inside the courthouse becomes unbearable. Judge Willem van der Merwe finally calls for order as the time for his verdict arrives. The benches are full, every seat occupied by journalists, supporters, detractors, and curious onlookers who know they are witnessing a moment that will etch itself into history. You lean forward with them, every breath held, waiting to hear how South Africa will judge Jacob Zuma. The judge begins by reviewing the evidence. His tone is deliberate, precise, as he weighs Kwesi's testimony against Zuma's defense. He acknowledges Kwesi's bravery, her difficult history, and the consistency in parts of her account. But then, point by point, he begins to highlight what he calls inconsistencies. He notes that Kwesi chose to remain in Zuma's home despite expressing fear that she did not physically resist during the act, and that her text messages to Zuma in the days surrounding the incident could be read as friendly, even affectionate. These details, he suggests, weaken the prosecution's case. Turning to Zuma's testimony, Judge van der Merwe scrutinizes the now infamous shower claim, but ultimately sets it aside as irrelevant to the question of consent. Instead, he focuses on credibility. He acknowledges that Zuma admitted the sexual encounter and presented it as consensual, and he concludes that the state failed to prove otherwise beyond a reasonable doubt. The words fall heavy. Jacob Zuma is acquitted of rape. The reaction is immediate. Zuma's supporters inside the courtroom break into applause, ululations, and chants of victory, their joy spilling into the streets where crowds have been waiting all day. Outside, a sea of people erupts, some in celebration, others in anger, their voices colliding into chaos. For Zuma's backers, this is proof of his innocence and a vindication of their loyalty. For Kweisi's supporters and many women's rights activists, it feels like a betrayal, a brutal reminder of how hard it is for victims to win against powerful men. The judge adds one more note in his ruling that stuns the nation. While acquitting Zuma, he reprimands him for recklessness, specifically for having unprotected sex with a woman he believed to be HIV positive. He stresses that as a leader and role model, Zuma had set a dangerous example. The admonishment is sharp, but to many, it feels hollow. The acquittal overshadows the rebuke, and the shower remark remains a lasting stain on Zuma's reputation. Kweisi, escorted out under protection, leaves the courthouse quietly. She does not stay to face the jeering crowds waiting outside, where thousands chant Zuma's name and mock her as a liar. For her, the trial has ended not with justice, but with exile. Within months, she will flee South Africa altogether, seeking safety in the Netherlands. Her voice is silenced in her homeland, while Zuma walks free to continue his political ascent. As you absorb the scene, you realize the trial has ended, but the deeper conflict is only beginning. The verdict has become more than a legal outcome. It is a mirror held up to South Africa. For some, it reflects the resilience of justice, protecting the innocent from false accusation. For others, it reflects the deep cracks in a system that bends to power and undermines women's voices. In either case, the trial has left scars that will not fade easily. And as Zuma exits the courthouse, smiling, raising his fist in triumph, you can feel the chilling weight of what has just occurred. The law has spoken, but the truth, whatever it may be, still lies contested in the shadows of public memory. You now follow the aftermath of the verdict, where the personal cost of the trial becomes painfully clear. For Kweisi, the woman who dared to accuse one of South Africa's most powerful men, life after the courtroom is marked by fear, isolation, and relentless public scrutiny. Her safety is under constant threat, her family faces harassment, and every time Zuma makes a public appearance, she must reckon with the fact that her accuser's acquittal has emboldened thousands who believe she lied. Kweisi's exile to the Netherlands in 2007 underscores the gravity of the backlash. Leaving South Africa, she sought protection from death threats, harassment, and the overwhelming stress of being vilified by a nation. She is remembered by activists as both a survivor and a trailblazer. Her courage to testify became a beacon for women in South Africa and beyond, highlighting how society often turns against the very individuals who speak truth to power. Investigators still question whether her forced removal from the country could have been prevented, whether authorities did enough to protect her. Meanwhile, Zuma's supporters frame her departure differently. To them, Kweisi's exit is proof of conspiracy, evidence that the opposition sought to ruin a political titan. They argue that media bias amplified her story unfairly and that she became a pawn in larger political games. Outside South Africa, these narratives mingle with online commentary, often muddying public perception and making it difficult to separate fact from political spin. One small, quirky detail emerges in the aftermath. Journalists note that Kweisi, despite her trauma, continued her activism abroad, attending conferences on HIV/AIDS awareness and speaking about women's rights. She refused to disappear quietly, even while facing ongoing threats. This duality, victim and advocate, silenced and outspoken, defines her legacy. Inside South Africa, the social repercussions of the trial linger. Gender-based violence activists use Kweisi's story as a rallying point, demanding reforms and better protection for survivors. Schools and universities discuss the case in gender studies and law courses. In the media, her story resurfaces regularly on anniversaries of the trial, ensuring that her voice continues to echo even as Zuma consolidates power. Politically, the trial does little to derail Zuma. Within months of his acquittal, he regains momentum in the ANC. His image as a resilient leader, someone who has survived both legal and political attacks, strengthens his appeal. Crowds gather at rallies with chants like "Zuma will lead," messages that starkly contrast with the quiet mourning of Kweisi's supporters. The juxtaposition is striking: a man emboldened, a woman silenced. Investigators still question whether the legal system inadvertently prioritized the reputation of a powerful man over the protection and dignity of a victim. The debate resonates beyond this single case, becoming a touchstone in South Africa's ongoing struggle with gender violence, societal expectations, and political influence. And yet, Kweisi's influence, though quieter now, endures. Her story informs legislation debates, activist strategies, and public awareness campaigns. She becomes, inadvertently, a symbol of the complexity of justice, that winning a trial in court does not always mean truth prevails, and that courage can leave enduring ripples long after the immediate outcome. You now watch as Jacob Zuma begins his political resurrection, a process that seems almost impervious to scandal. Despite the shadow of both corruption allegations and the high-profile rape trial, he rises steadily through the ranks of the African National Congress. By 2007, at the ANC's National Conference in Polokwane, he secures the party presidency, defeating Thabo Mbeki in a surprise victory that leaves the country stunned. This is the paradox of Jacob Zuma, the president accused of rape, acquitted yet embattled, exonerated yet unbowed, politically impervious even as controversy simmers. Zuma's charisma, a trait honed during his anti-apartheid years and prison time on Robben Island, plays a key role. He connects to ordinary South Africans with an ease that political strategists call authentic populism. He dances at rallies, speaks in relatable vernacular, and positions himself as a man of the people, someone who has endured struggle and emerged victorious. Investigators still question whether this performance is genuine or a calculated manipulation of public sentiment, but its effect is undeniable. Loyalty grows and his base expands. Meanwhile, the country remains divided. Opposition parties, civil society organizations, and women's rights activists continue to hold Zuma accountable for the past, while his supporters frame every attack as politically motivated. This polarization illustrates the dual reality of Zuma's career: legally cleared, yet morally contested. Even as he campaigns for national leadership, South Africans wrestle with questions about justice, consent, and accountability. A quirky detail from this period illustrates the blending of politics and culture. At one rally, Zuma's supporters distributed miniature figurines of him wearing traditional Zulu attire and dancing mid-step. It became a collectible, almost playful emblem of loyalty, yet also a stark reminder of the idolization that can shield leaders from scrutiny. Politics, spectacle, and personal scandal intertwine in ways that leave observers both fascinated and uneasy. By 2009, Zuma achieves what many thought impossible. He becomes president of South Africa. His inauguration is celebrated with chants, songs, and public fanfare, a culmination of decades of struggle, survival, and resilience. Yet beneath the ceremonial joy lies the unresolved tension of his past. Kweisi's story, though distant now, continues to inform debates on gender and leadership. Investigators still question whether a nation can truly move forward without reckoning fully with such histories. Zuma's presidency demonstrates a complex dynamic: a man accused of sexual assault now shaping laws, policies, and national priorities. His governance is marked by both initiatives aimed at social welfare and ongoing corruption scandals that echo the controversies preceding his rise. For South Africa, the duality is constant. Pride in his liberation struggle achievements, discomfort at the moral questions left in the wake of his personal life. As you trace this trajectory, you realize how Jacob Zuma, the president accused of rape, is not merely a story of accusation and acquittal. It is a story about resilience, loyalty, and the intertwining of personal and political narratives. Even as he leads a nation, the shadow of the trial lingers, shaping perceptions, influencing policy discussions, and framing debates about power, morality, and justice. You now examine how Jacob Zuma's legacy continues to reverberate decades after the trial, illustrating the complex interplay between power, public perception, and accountability. Even as his presidency advances, the shadow of the 2005-2006 rape trial never fully dissipates. In the streets, in classrooms, and in policy debates, the trial becomes a reference point, a cautionary tale about the limits of justice, the vulnerability of women, and the resilience of political figures. In the years following his election, Zuma faces numerous challenges: corruption investigations, mounting economic inequality, and contentious relationships with both allies and opposition leaders. Yet, despite these issues, his political survival is remarkable. His supporters argue that every attack is part of a continuous effort to undermine a man who represents the common citizen. Critics, meanwhile, frame the narrative differently, seeing his ascent as a reflection of a political culture where accountability is often secondary to loyalty and charisma. Investigators still question whether Zuma's acquittal emboldened him to navigate scandals with impunity, relying on public adoration and internal party loyalty to shield him. A quirky element emerges in media coverage during this period: Zuma's affinity for extravagant public displays, including traditional Zulu ceremonies, large-scale birthday celebrations, and public dances at official events. These spectacles are often covered extensively by national and international media, transforming cultural rituals into political theater. They also serve to humanize him to his supporters while further polarizing detractors, who see the pageantry as a distraction from pressing national problems. Meanwhile, Kwezi's story continues to resonate internationally. Feminist organizations and women's rights advocates highlight her courage as emblematic of the difficulties survivors face when confronting powerful men. Her forced exile and subsequent activism abroad underscore the personal cost of challenging authority in a patriarchal and politically charged environment. Her legacy influences advocacy, legal reforms, and public awareness campaigns on gender-based violence, leaving an enduring imprint on South African society. Zuma's presidency and the echoes of the trial also prompt national reflection. South Africa grapples with questions about how society treats allegations of sexual assault against powerful men, how the legal system supports or fails survivors, and what accountability looks like in the intersection of law, politics, and culture. Educational programs, university courses, and public discussions repeatedly reference the trial as a case study in both leadership and the challenges of justice. By the mid-2010s, Zuma's political fortunes begin to waver under mounting corruption allegations unrelated to the rape trial. Yet, interestingly, public memory frequently separates these scandals. The rape trial, already historic, is recalled with a mixture of political and moral complexity, while corruption accusations provoke different debates. In effect, the trial shapes not just legal narratives but also the broader story of Zuma as a polarizing figure. Investigators still question whether South Africa's reckoning with gender-based violence could have been stronger had the trial outcome been different. Could legal accountability have shifted the national conversation? Could Kwezi's safety and dignity have been better protected? These questions remain, not just in legal scholarship but in collective memory. And so, the tale of Jacob Zuma. The president accused of rape lingers, illustrating the tension between personal accountability and political power, between courage and vulnerability, between truth and perception. Even decades later, it reminds the nation that justice is never only about verdicts. It is about the stories that survive, the voices that echo, and the lives that are shaped in their wake. You reach the final section of the story, where reflection and consequence merge. Jacob Zuma. The president accused of rape is no longer just a courtroom drama. It is a lens through which South Africa continues to examine power, gender, and the enduring complexities of justice. By the time Zuma leaves the presidency in 2018, the political and personal legacy of the trial remains firmly intertwined with his public persona. The nation has seen both his resilience and the deep wounds left in the wake of allegations that could not be proven in court. The trial and its aftermath have left indelible marks. Zuma's legal acquittal allowed him to rise politically, but the moral and social debates sparked by the case have continued to shape public consciousness. Gender-based violence advocates cite the trial as a catalyst for awareness campaigns, education programs, and legislation aimed at protecting women and strengthening the justice system. The nation's courts, too, reflect on the handling of high-profile cases, questioning whether procedural technicalities inadvertently undermine victims' rights. Investigators still question whether the legal system was adequately equipped to balance power, celebrity, and justice in a fair and transparent manner. A quirky detail highlights the lingering tension. Even years later, Zuma's trial is referenced in memes, political cartoons, and satire shows. The infamous shower claim is repeated and reinterpreted in popular culture, often in exaggerated or humorous ways, demonstrating how public memory can distort or simplify complex legal narratives. Yet beneath the humor lies an enduring societal discomfort, a reminder that the trial exposed fundamental issues about consent, power, and accountability. Kwesi's legacy, in contrast, is quieter but equally potent. Though she passed away in 2016, her courage is commemorated in activism, academic discourse, and public campaigns. She symbolizes the struggles of countless women confronting systems that privilege the powerful. Her story, often overshadowed by Zuma's political ascent, persists in discussions about justice, ethics, and the societal responsibility to protect survivors. Politically, Zuma's tenure as president faced numerous other controversies, but the rape trial is always present in the public's imagination, shaping his image both domestically and internationally. It demonstrates the paradox of power. Legal acquittal does not erase moral scrutiny, and political success does not erase social accountability. The trial became more than a personal conflict. It became a case study in how society navigates truth, influence, and memory. As you sit with this narrative, you sense its broader lesson. The intersection of personal conduct and public office has consequences that extend far beyond courtrooms. Allegations, acquittals, and media coverage all ripple outward, affecting families, communities, and national dialogue. Zuma's story illustrates how public figures can shape history, but also how survivors' voices continue to resonate, challenging societies to reconcile justice with power. Finally, in the calm aftermath, you reflect on the lives intertwined with the case. A president whose path to power was tested by allegations he denied. A courageous young woman whose bravery continues to inspire, and a nation that remains caught between reverence, outrage, and reflection. Jacob Zuma. The president accused of rape is both cautionary and instructive, a story that asks over and over how we measure accountability, integrity, and courage. As you settle into the quiet of reflection, the story of Jacob Zuma and Kwesi lingers not as a sensational headline, but as a profound meditation on justice, resilience, and the human consequences of power. You think about the courage it took for Kwesi to step forward in a society that often silences women, and the societal forces that enabled Zuma to navigate scandal without derailing his ambitions. Their lives, forever entwined by this singular event, illuminate the delicate balance between law, morality, and public perception. You breathe slowly, letting the weight of decades of history sink in. South Africa's journey from apartheid to democracy, from liberation struggle to modern governance, is mirrored in the trial. Triumphs, failings, and the stubborn persistence of both hope and injustice. You imagine the streets outside the courtroom, once echoing with chants and jeers, now quiet, yet still resonating with the questions the trial provoked. You feel the tension between the human desire for accountability and the limitations of legal systems, and recognize how truth can exist alongside ambiguity. In this reflective space, you sense the lingering lessons that courage matters, even when outcomes are uncertain, that public figures wield influence with consequences beyond the personal, and that survivors' voices, even when silenced, echo through time. The trial may have ended, but its impact continues to shape conversations about justice, gender, and power. You exhale, letting the story settle into memory. This is a tale not just of accusation or acquittal, but of the human capacity to endure, resist, and provoke change. And as night falls and the world grows quiet, you carry with you the weight and the lessons of Jacob Zuma, the president accused of rape, allowing them to linger softly in thought and conscience.